Well, so often there are times that we talk about men of faith, and it seems like just about any time you can find men of faith as you look through the materials that are available in Christendom, resources that are available. But how often do you find women of faith talked about? Maybe current women who are strong in their faith, maybe some who are teaching on a regular basis, who have become well known through social media. But the truth is, if you dig back a little bit into history, it's kind of hard to find a long list of women of faith. Well, I know somebody who has spent some time finding some women of faith, and we're going to talk about that today. Jamie Janosz is a wife, a mother, a writer. She's a content development manager for Moody Bible Institute. She writes devotionals regularly for the Today in the Word daily devotional, and she's even published nonfiction essays with Christianity Today's hermeneutics blog. She's written a book called When Others Shuddered, 8 Women Who Refused to Give Up. That's going to be our topic today. Jamie, so great to talk to you again.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and excited about this topic.
I want to start with what I just kind of said. I'm assuming in some way, maybe that's what played into the reasons you wrote this book, just a lack of women of faith being easily accessed through resources?
Well, yeah, I've always loved biographies. Even as a little girl, I would gravitate to that section of the library. I don't know if you remember this, but they had little hardcover books on these different famous people that weren't that long. And I just loved, and I'd especially go to the women, Florence Nightingale or Clara Barton, these kinds of people. But then as I got older and I read some missionary biographies, I read some of Elizabeth Elliot's work, various people that influenced me, Johnny Erickson Tada's story. They influenced me, my faith too, not just because they were interesting people. So that's always been a passion of mine. I like old things. I like looking at the past. I like history. But yeah, I started digging into women who lived at the turn of the century. And it came about for a couple of reasons. One is that I lived downtown Chicago, worked for Moody, and I had stumbled across some letters between Emma Dreyer, a woman who helped found Moody. So they were correspondence between her and D.L. Moody. That sparked my imagination. What were these women doing at this time? How did she get involved? How did she get to Chicago? So all of those questions. And then I had read another book called Sin in the Second City. And it was really about the horrible conditions in Chicago at the turn of the century, including sex trafficking, prostitution, all of these evils of society. And in it, they mentioned that there were women involved kind of going into those areas and helping reach people, Christian women. So I thought, who were these women, and did they know Emma, and what was it like? So it was really a rabbit trail of trying to find out who these women were at this time period that were changing the world for Jesus. So it became an adventure for me, a little bit of a mystery.
Yeah, that's awesome. And those are great books and great information to pass along. We're going to dig into some of that in just a moment. How did you narrow down this group to 8? How did you choose who was going to make the final cut, if you will?
That was really hard. So I was looking at Emma originally, and so I branched out from her. I was looking at women who lived over the turn of the century, the old turn of the century, so 1800s to 1900s. So I was looking for that. I was looking for women of faith and women who lived mainly in urban areas and ministered there. So I was curious about that. So I kind of branched, and then I had to find women that enough was written about them. So I did find others where I'd find a snippet or a small story, but these women had enough that I could find and gather, a substantial amount about them.
Well, since you mentioned her a couple of times, I think it'd probably be good that we start with Emma Dreyer. Many people who aren't maybe familiar with the Moody Bible Institute story may not be familiar with her, but boy, what an incredibly powerful life she led, and an influencer. If you talk about influencers before social media, right. Emma Dreyer was an influencer. Talk a little bit about her life and some of her influence.
Yeah, so she grew up. There's some mystery a little bit about her background. Some people say she was an orphan, some say she was not, but she was very smart, intelligent. So she had gone on for further schooling, and like many intelligent young women of that age, she continued and started teaching. So they kind of rose to the top, and if they didn't get married, that was an option for a career. So she started teaching. She went to Illinois State Normal School at the time. It's now Illinois State University, where she was a superintendent teaching teachers, and ended up coming up to Chicago to spend time with friends. She had been recovering off and on from illnesses. And that's where she encountered D.L. Moody and also the Christian work that was going on in the city of Chicago. So suddenly her focus was a little torn. Here was this woman who had great success in a teaching career and yet started to feel the pull of, is there something more worthy? And in fact, D.L. Moody challenged her in a get together. And he said, he goes, there's hundreds of people teaching. He goes, but only a few who have the passion for teaching God's word. So he said, couldn't you do this with your life? Shouldn't you do something better? And she heard that and took it to heart. And of course, right after that, the Chicago fire happened, and that also challenged her. So there were some pivotal moments in there, meeting Moody and getting struck by the needs of people, especially post-fire, that she started saying, we need to get God's word into all areas of our city. And she was methodical and determined about that. So really a Bible teacher at heart, and also a charitable worker, tireless worker.
As we talk about these ladies today, and I want to come back to Emma in just a moment, one of the things that was written in describing your book, it says, these women wanted to live lives less ordinary. I love that turn of phrase. To live a life less ordinary. I think we often all think of ourselves as ordinary, but we always most of us aspire to more. Whatever that is. At the same time, we often can feel like one person can't do enough. We just can't make a big enough influence. But the truth is, and what we talk a lot about on these podcasts and on my radio program, is what one person can do. And that's just in response and obedience to what God has called us to do. He's got a plan for us, and he's got things for us to do. And chances are, if we're obedient, we're going to find out it will be a bit extraordinary. It's just taking those steps of obedience. Interesting that you mentioned the fire, because that's one of the things. Certainly D.L. Moody had been interested in evangelism for a long time, but that fire in Chicago that damaged so much and killed so many, that really changed his focus. Sounds like the same thing happened with Emma after the fire.
Yeah, she said she lost everything in the fire, all of her possessions. In fact, if you try to research her, you find a lot of blanks. And I think that's partly what happened. So her papers and her belongings, everything was gone. But she was so resolute. She was a determined person. And one thing I tried in my research is to be really honest about these people. So she was single and she was lonely. Very often commenting on the loneliness of being single. She struggled with that, living in boarding rooms and such. And she was kind of fierce. Sometimes she stepped on toes because she was determined that things get done and they get done well. She even stepped on D.L. Moody's toes in that respect. And so but that was what pushed her and organized her and really started the Moody Bible Institute. Was her determination. Her and Moody had talked about this school that would be a training ground for Christian workers. And he said, he was involved in a lot of things. So he was a mover and shaker of his time and an evangelist. So he was pulled a lot of directions. Meanwhile, she stayed back in Chicago and was raising funds, getting this thing organized. And then when it was time when she had the money, she reached out to him. He was in New York. And he was busy. And he said, you know what? I'm not sure we're going to do Chicago. Well, you can imagine, when I found this letter of hers, you could see the pencil gouged into the paper. She was upset.
She didn't like that news.
Yeah, she took him to task, and she's like, you need to get back here. We're ready, and it's time to do this thing. And he cut ties with her at that moment. He was angry. And yet his wife, I think, was instrumental in pulling him back and calming him down. He did return, and then the school founded, and it exists today. So I often credit, yes, it was his school and his vision, but it was her vision too, and she was instrumental in not letting it die. She helped it go.
The school has been in existence now for 100 and I think it's 34, 35 years. Mm-hmm. Thousands and thousands of people trained, missionaries all over the world. You would say, I think that it's safe to say that it might not have happened had Emma not pushed.
Yeah, or maybe not that soon. I'm not sure, but she just really was. She had captured the vision of it. And she said, we just can't let this go. And really, he had the vision of it too. Obviously, at the beginning, his heart was big and deep for this kind of work. But I credit her tenacity. I think sometimes women still get a hard time over that. People who are kind of pushers and try to get things done. But she did. And to her credit, that it did get done, and it launched, and it was a great success. It was training early. We've done some research into the early students, and they were a lot of immigrants coming in. Many of them didn't speak English, a lot of women, a lot of minority students, people you wouldn't necessarily expect, but they were launching these missionaries into all the world from Moody.
Yeah. And I do think that's a key piece not to miss is Moody Bible Institute, one of the first organizations of its kind that were teaching women regularly and immigrants from all over the world, and doing so faithfully. And that was not something that was normal at that time, best I could tell from
it's
what
puzzling, because you think people didn't go on for higher education much, and what were they doing? But it wasn't really, it was really a training school in the Bible. And Emma Dreyer was convinced that the Bible was the solution for all the issues in the world. She really felt like the biblical solution had to be integrated all the time.
Let's move on to another name. This one probably people have heard, usually tied to music, and that's Fanny Crosby. Why did you pick her, and tell us a little bit about her story?
This became a little bit of that, you've heard the 6 degrees of separation. So I kept finding one woman would lead to another woman, and people would intersect with other people, which makes sense because they were all ministering in and around the same time. But Fanny Crosby is known to me as a hymn writer. She's written many of my most favorite hymns. I still play them on the piano, and very often I'll look and I'll be like, yep, that's Fanny again. She was a prolific hymn writer. She was also blind from infancy. So those two concepts are enough to boggle my mind right there. But she had this kind of spirit that just was relentlessly positive and just all in for Jesus. She had said, there was a quote I have of hers, and I'll not say it as well, but she told her mom she didn't mind being blind because the first face she would ever see would be the face of Jesus. She had that kind of, I don't know, I think, would I be that way? I'm not sure, but she didn't tend to feel sorry for herself. She attended a school for the blind in New York. So she left her family home. And this was kind of a novel thing at the time. So there weren't many of these. Learned to read Braille, became a teacher there, fell in love there. And at the same time, lyrics just kept coming out of her. And she penned so many that she has also just dozens of pseudonyms, because people were getting maybe tired of seeing the same name. I'm not sure. Some of them were male names too. But she just published and published and published, as well as taught, with a real heart for just doing whatever she could for God.
Do you remember a few of those hymns? Would you be able to mention a couple of those that people would be familiar with?
Well, Rescue the Perishing is one. That one is interesting in her story because she was avidly at work in street missions in New York. So she would go, and you don't hear that side of her story very often, but she was a worker. She was a volunteer there, and would serve the lost. So rescue the perishing, care for the dying, right? Blessed Assurance. But yeah, those are some of she just had these simple lyrics, but very deep and heartfelt. And they're still sung today. We sang one in church the other day too. And at first I was like, is that Fanny again? Because they've modernized them now. They'll do the hymn and then they'll weave in the modern.
Right.
But still they still, they still work for people because they were simple and true and profound.
And so many of those hymns still sung today, as you said, in some form or fashion, so many years later. Let's talk about another lady. I think that many people who may have been around the civil rights movement or have been around some of those standout names of people who were African American might know Mary McLeod Bethune, but many may not know her full story. Tell us a bit about how you got to her and some of her story.
I noticed her. She also came out of the Moody Bible Institute archives for me because there's a class picture where she was the only African-American face in this crowd of people. So I was curious about her story. And when you learn about her, she was just an extraordinary person. I now live in Florida and I'm very close to where her home was, and I've toured it. You can still go in it. And her college is there, Bethune-Cookman College, as well as a statue in the town. So she's renowned here. But she was born into a family of, eventually former slaves. She was the first child born into freedom. And she was the first child they sent to school. So a missionary school happened and she learned to read and write. She talks about her dreams as a child of wanting books and wanting glass windows in a house. So grew up very impoverished, but very bright and very capable and also very fervent in her faith. So she went through all of these schoolings. A benefactor, a young woman, was a benefactor that invested in her education. And so she was able to go on and she went to Moody as well. So she did attend Moody Bible Institute. It wasn't a 3-year school or a 4-year school at that time. It was a short course, but she had been accepted. She had been applying to be a missionary before she attended Moody. And she was intending to go to Africa. That was her dream as a missionary. So she was in correspondence with missionaries there. She had been accepted and she was attending Moody to kind of finish the course and get ready to go. The hard part of her story is that near the end of her time, she got a letter from the mission board saying they'd changed their mind and that they were no longer accepting African American missionaries in Africa, which, in our modern day sensibility, we say, what? And she responded, a colleague of mine, Mary Cloutier, found a letter from her in the files of the Presbyterian Missionary Board. And this young woman, Mary Bethune, very composed, said, I don't think Jesus would care about the color of my skin. But, I'm still determined to serve him. So instead of going to Africa, she felt God leading her south, and she started a school for the very, very poor that could not read and write down a few towns away from me in Daytona Beach, Florida. So she scrapped it together. She got investors, and she withstood a lot of criticism. But her work got so much notice. It started to grow. The school started to grow. Her services toward the community grew, that it caught the attention of presidents who were dealing with issues of race. And so she became advisors to presidents, friends of Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt. So just a renowned woman that just kept going. Like, even though she had this big deterrent, and many of the women in my book faced obstacles. Sometimes they were enormous. Fanny's blindness, Emma's singleness and loneliness, and even the no she got from D.L. Moody. And with Mary, this huge no, you can't go to Africa. Why would we accept you? Obviously you're Black. And she was like, well, then God's going to use me elsewhere. So this ability to turn it around and to keep on mission is remarkable to me.
I think we've got time for maybe one more. Is there another one that really touches your heart, or that really just meant something to you as you dug into their story?
Oh, I always say it's kind of like my children. They're all my favorite, right? But maybe there was this one woman that I kind of stumbled on. Her name was Virginia Asher, and she lived and also attended Moody. And again, I didn't intend to make this a Moody book, and they aren't all Moody students, but they all did intersect with D.L. Moody's life somehow, which surprised me. But Virginia had a passion for helping women in the city. So she had two areas of outreach. One was into the brothels, which was amazing to me. So she would go into the brothel district and very often meet and pray with the women. So the women who owned this famous brothel in Chicago at the time would call her in, and she would come in when someone was sick or dying or in need, and she would spend time and pray with them and read the Bible to them. And I've often thought, wow, how did she and she was a cultured woman, how did she get away with that? And why did she feel brave enough to do that? She also had a burden for the shop girls, that were called. So they were the young women who worked in all the industrialist factories. So they would have lunch breaks, and she would go in there and organize Bible studies, prayer meetings, and just meet with them and care for them. So and they called her later on. She had groups and groups and groups of women all across the country that met out of the startings that she had done. And they called her a torchbearer, that she was the light that had started this, and it just spread. For me, she's an example of just seeing the need in front of you and being, showing Jesus to those people. Her name isn't in a lot of books, but she had a remarkable influence.
Each one of these stories, and the ones that we haven't talked about today, not only have this example of living lives less ordinary, that desire to do something more, but really it seems to be this story again of a difference that each person can make if they love the Lord and are obedient to his calling. I think we often are given opportunities by the Lord, and we don't take those opportunities. I look back at my life and I think, how many things would I have missed if I hadn't said yes to something? Mm-hmm. One of my favorite recent Moody authors is a young lady named Jennifer Hand, and she's written a book about giving her yes to God. I've kind of hung on to that because I think it's just such a simple message and a simple way of understanding how to effectively live the Christian life. These women, young or old, as they were presented with opportunities, said yes. I mean, especially turn of the century, there would have been plenty of no's thrown at them, either from others or from their own feeling that I can't accomplish this with these surroundings, with these situations around me, with these people around me. Yet they said yes. And I just feel like each one of us has those. It may be a one lifetime call. To me, it's been more just a series of tons of little things of calls to say yes. Talk for just a moment about maybe some of those things you see in the lives of these women that reflect that, or other things that seemed similar as you brought them all together.
Yeah, I definitely see that. One thing I noted when I got done with the book is looking at their lives. At the end of their lives, you go, oh, they did great things for God, right? These were amazing, amazing lives, well lived. But if you read into their lives in the nitty gritty, there's a lot of stops and starts. There's a lot of pauses. There's a lot of discouragement. There's tragedy. But each time it's like they stood up again and refocused, right? Stood up, refocused on what God wanted them to do. And they were aware of what was around them and the simple need for people to know Jesus and to know God's word. And they were obedient in that. So I think it's not so much as setting out to be a great person or a great influencer, which is easy to fall into in this culture.
Yeah.
But what are we saying, like you said, what are we saying yes to? What would have happened if Mary had just said, well, I can't be a missionary. It's not my fault. That's an injustice, and then just sat back and had a good life. Or if Fanny Crosby said, well, it's blind. Obviously, I can't do anything. I don't have the ability to see. How is God going to use me? Yeah. But they didn't. They just kept going. And I think, I titled it, They Refused to Give Up, because I do think sometimes we tend to give up. So it's raising our hand and saying, yes, we'll do it. We're going to try, and we're going to see how God can use us in the place we're at instead of where we wish we could be, maybe.
Well, it's an incredibly powerful book. And again, there's 8 women here that you can read about if you're interested. And we'll put a link in today's program podcast notes. When Others Shuddered, 8 Women Who Refused to Give Up. Jamie Janosz is the author. And it's incredibly encouraging to me to see and hear these stories. And Jamie, I just want to thank you personally for, I know that it's a huge investment of time and research and effort to put something like this together. But again, there are so few resources. Maybe there's books obviously on like an Elizabeth Elliot, someone that just kind of rises to the top. But there's so many women of faith who have never had their story told. And I thank you for taking the opportunity to tell some of these stories and make sure that we're aware of them. And I pray that people who might be watching or listening today might take advantage of this book and learn more about some of these strong women of faith. And I think we all, male or female, have an opportunity to learn many lessons from their lives as well. Thanks so much for the book, and thank you so much for your time today. It's always good to connect.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.